The Atlantic doesn't forget. It holds secrets in its depths, wraps them in salt and darkness, and waits. In the summer of 1926, the Carroway family learned this truth in the cruelest way possible. For 3 generations, they had lived on the Massachusetts coast, building their fortune on whispers and shadows, convinced the ocean would guard what they buried beneath its waves. But the sea has no loyalty. It takes what it wants, and when it's ready, it gives back, twisted, wrong, and impossible to ignore. The story begins on a morning that felt like any other. Gulls screamed over Beacon's Edge, the small fishing town where the Carroways had planted their roots in 1875. The family's mansion sat on the cliff's highest point, a sprawling Victorian structure with weathered shingles and windows that caught the sunrise like copper coins. Below, the town sprawled along the harbour, fishing boats tied to worn docks, the cannery's smokestacks rising against the sky, and Main Street's brick storefronts where fishermen bought coffee before dawn. Thomas Carroway stood in his study that morning, 42 years old, with silver threading through his dark hair. He wore a pressed suit despite the early hour, his routine as rigid as the tide tables he kept in his desk drawer. Through the window, he watched the ocean, calm, deceptive, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. His father had taught him to respect the water. His grandfather had taught him to use it. The Carroway fortune came from shipping officially. The family owned 3 vessels that ran routes between Boston and Port South, carrying textiles, lumber, and manufactured goods. The legitimate business made them comfortable. But comfort wasn't wealth, and wealth was what the Carroways craved. So they'd found other cargo to move: Canadian whiskey during Prohibition, contraband from Europe, goods that never appeared on any manifest. The profits were extraordinary. The risks were managed by paying the right people and using the ocean as their vault. Thomas had inherited more than ships from his father. He'd inherited a system, a network of corrupt officials and silent partners who took their cut and asked no questions. Every month, Thomas made the same calculation: how much to hide, how much to claim, how much to bury where no tax collector or federal agent could find it. The ocean floor became their safe deposit box. Weighted crates sank into the depths off Carroway Point, marked only by coordinates Thomas kept in a leather journal locked in his desk. His wife Margaret knew nothing of the details. She was 38, elegant in the way wealthy women of that era cultivated, hair perfectly waved, dresses from Boston boutiques, a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She managed the household, hosted dinner parties for town officials, and raised their 2 children with the strict propriety expected of a Carroway. Their son William was 19, studying at Harvard, and already learning to navigate the family business through carefully worded letters. Their daughter, Eleanor, was 16, restless and sharp-eyed, always asking questions Thomas never wanted to answer. That morning, as Thomas reviewed shipping invoices, his foreman knocked on the study door. Frank Morrison had worked for the Carroways for 15 years, a stocky man with calloused hands and the discretion of a priest. His face was pale when Thomas looked up. "Sir, we have a problem at the docks." Thomas set down his pen. "What kind of problem?" "The fishermen found something this morning. Pulled it up in their nets about 2 miles offshore." "Debris happens, Frank. Have them dispose of it." Frank shifted his weight, his jaw tight. "It's not debris, sir. It's one of our crates." The words hung in the air like smoke. Thomas felt his pulse quicken, but his expression remained neutral. "Which crate?" "The one from March. The markings are still visible." Thomas stood slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. March. The crate from March contained $50,000 in cash and negotiable bonds, payment from a rum-running operation they'd facilitated. It should have been resting in 60 feet of water, invisible and untouchable. Where is it now? "Still on the fishing boat. Captain Reeves has it. He's asking questions." Thomas grabbed his hat from the stand. Captain Reeves was a problem. The man was honest, annoyingly so, and had never taken Carroway money. If he'd seen what was inside that crate, if he started talking to the wrong people, everything Thomas had built would collapse. "Get the car," Thomas said. "We're going to the docks. And Frank, bring 2 men you trust." The harbor smelled like it always did: salt, fish, diesel fuel, and the perpetual dampness that clung to everything near the water. Thomas stepped out of his black Cadillac onto the weathered planks of the commercial pier, Frank Morrison beside him and two dock workers trailing behind. The morning sun was higher now, burning off the fog that had shrouded the coast at dawn. Fishing boats bobbed in their slips, their crews already out or preparing to leave. But one vessel remained stationary, drawing a small crowd. The Mary Catherine was a 30-foot trawler, her paint peeling and her nets permanently stained with fish scales. Captain Joel Reeves stood on deck, arms crossed over his thick chest, his weathered face set in lines of suspicion. He was 55, a man who'd fished these waters his entire life and had no patience for anyone who treated the ocean with disrespect. Around him, a half-dozen fishermen and dock workers murmured, their eyes fixed on the wooden crate sitting on the deck like an accusation. Thomas approached with measured steps, his expression calm and mildly curious. "Captain Reeves, I heard you had an unusual catch this morning." Reeves didn't smile. "That's one way to put it, Mr. Carroway. Found this tangled in my nets about 2 miles out, right off your point. Strange place for cargo to be sitting on the ocean floor, don't you think?" Thomas glanced at the crate. It was 3 feet long, waterlogged but intact, with rope burns along its edges where Reeves's nets had caught it. The Carroway marking, a small C carved into the corner, was still visible beneath the grime. His mind raced through explanations, discarding the ones that wouldn't hold up to scrutiny. "Looks like one of ours," Thomas admitted, keeping his tone casual. "We lost some cargo in a storm last spring. The ship took on water near the point and we had to jettison several crates to stay afloat. I filed a report with the harbour master. It was a lie, smooth and practiced. There had been no storm, no lost cargo, no report. But Reeves couldn't prove otherwise, and Thomas was betting the man wouldn't push too hard without evidence." Reeves's eyes narrowed. "Funny thing about that, this crate's got fresh rope marks on it, like someone lowered it down deliberate. And it was weighted, had chunks of scrap iron bolted to the bottom. Storm jettison doesn't usually involve iron weights, Mr. Carroway." The crowd around them had grown. Thomas recognized faces, dock workers, fishermen, the harbour master's assistant, all watching, all listening. He needed to control this before it spread beyond the pier. "Captain, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention," Thomas said smoothly, "but I'm not sure what you're implying. If you have concerns about salvage rights, we can discuss compensation for your trouble. Otherwise, I'll have my men take the crate and dispose of it properly." "I'm not talking about salvage rights," Reeves shot back. "I'm talking about what's inside. I opened it." Thomas felt ice slide down his spine, but his face remained perfectly composed. "And? Money, a lot of it. Bonds, too. All wrapped in oilcloth like someone was planning to come back for it." Reeves stepped closer, lowering his voice, but not enough that the crowd couldn't hear. "I've lived in this town my whole life, Mr. Carroway. I know your family's got connections, got money, got influence, but I also know when something doesn't smell right. And this," he gestured at the crate, "this smells like low tide." Thomas could feel the weight of eyes on him, the silent judgment of men who worked for their living and didn't trust wealthy families with secrets. He needed to shift the narrative, and fast. "Captain Reeves, I understand your concern, but jumping to conclusions helps no one. That crate contains emergency funds we keep on our vessels, standard practice for ships operating far from port. If it ended up on the ocean floor, it was an accident or theft by crew members we've since dismissed. Either way, it's my property, legally salvaged. I'll compensate you for your time and trouble, but the crate comes with me." Reeves's jaw tightened. "I already sent word to the Federal Revenue Office in Boston. They're sending someone to investigate." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow, though he didn't let it show. Federal investigators meant questions, audits, scrutiny. It meant examining shipping records, interviewing crew members, digging into finances the Carroways had worked decades to keep hidden. One crate could unravel everything. Thomas smiled, cold and calculated. "Then I suppose we'll both have our chance to explain things to the authorities. In the meantime, that crate stays exactly where it is. Understood?" He turned and walked back toward his car, Frank and the dock workers following. But as he climbed into the Cadillac, Thomas allowed himself one glance back at the Mary Catherine. Reeves stood on deck, arms still crossed, watching with the patient determination of a man who believed he'd done the right thing. Thomas knew better. The right thing, in Beacon's Edge, was whatever the Carroways decided it was, and Captain Joel Reeves had just made himself a problem that needed solving. The Carroway mansion felt oppressive that afternoon, its high ceilings and dark wood paneling closing in like a trap. Thomas sat in his study, the leather journal open on his desk, his finger tracing the coordinates he'd recorded in March. Every drop site was documented with meticulous precision: depth, distance from shore, date, contents. The journal represented 3 years of carefully hidden wealth, nearly $500,000 in cash, bonds, and negotiable instruments that federal authorities would love to find. One crate had surfaced. The question burning in Thomas's mind was simple. Why now? He'd used the same system for years. Weighted crates, deep water, coordinates marked and memorized. The ocean currents off Carrowway Point were predictable, the depth sufficient to keep the crates invisible to everyone, except those who knew exactly where to look. Yet somehow, one had broken free and drifted into Reeves's nets. Either the weights had failed, or someone had deliberately moved it. The second possibility made Thomas's blood run cold. If someone knew about the drop sites, if they were sabotaging his operation, then every crate was at risk. And if the federal investigators started searching the waters off Carroway Point, they'd find enough evidence to send him to prison for decades. Margaret knocked softly before entering, carrying a tea service on a silver tray. She set it on the side table, her movements practiced and graceful. "You've been in here for hours, Thomas. The children are asking about you. Tell them I'm working. They know something's wrong." She poured tea into a china cup, her voice carefully neutral. "Eleanor heard the servants talking about trouble at the docks." Thomas looked up sharply. What did she hear? Only rumors, something about Captain Reeves finding contraband. She asked me what it meant. Margaret's hands were steady, but her eyes held questions she was too well trained to ask directly. Their marriage was built on unspoken agreements. She managed the household and social appearances, he managed everything else. She knew the Carroway fortune had murky origins, but she'd never pressed for details. "It's nothing that concerns her," Thomas said, "or you." "Thomas," Margaret's voice dropped, "if there's trouble, I need to know. For the children's sake, if not mine. William's future depends on this family's reputation, Eleanor's marriage prospects." "We'll be fine," Thomas interrupted. "I'm handling it." Margaret studied him for a long moment, then nodded and left, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Thomas returned to his journal, calculating. The federal investigator would arrive within days. He needed to move the remaining crates before then, relocate them somewhere beyond federal jurisdiction, or dispose of the evidence entirely. But moving 20 crates in secret, without drawing attention, would require resources and time he didn't have. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Frank Morrison entered, his expression grim. "Sir, we have another problem." Thomas's jaw tightened. "What now?" "2 more crates washed up, different locations, both within the last hour. One near the lighthouse, another on the beach below your property. Same markings, same weights torn off like something ripped them loose." Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "That's impossible. Those weights are bolted through half-inch steel. They don't just tear off." "I know, sir, but someone's finding them, or something's bringing them up." Frank paused. "The fishermen are talking. They're saying the ocean's giving back what we put down there, calling it a reckoning." "Fishermen are superstitious idiots," Thomas snapped. But his mind was racing. 3 crates in one day, all from different drop sites, all with their weights mysteriously removed. Either someone with extensive knowledge of his operation was sabotaging him, or the ocean currents had shifted in ways his calculations hadn't predicted. Neither explanation was acceptable. "Get a boat ready," Thomas ordered. "Tonight, after dark. I want to inspect the drop sites personally. Bring diving equipment and 3 men who can keep their mouths shut." Frank nodded. "What about the crates that washed up? Secure them, move them to the warehouse on the north property. And Frank, make sure no one else sees them. No one." After Frank left, Thomas walked to the window overlooking the ocean. The water was calm, deceptively peaceful, stretching toward the horizon in shades of blue and gray. Somewhere beneath those waves, 17 more crates waited in the darkness, holding secrets that could destroy everything he'd built. The Carroways had always believed the ocean would protect them. His grandfather had started the practice, using the sea as a hiding place where land-based authorities couldn't reach. His father had expanded it, perfecting the system of weighted drops and careful record-keeping. Thomas had inherited that confidence, that certainty that the Atlantic would guard their secrets forever. But now, standing at the window as afternoon light slanted across the water, Thomas felt the first whisper of doubt. The ocean had held their secrets for decades. What if it had decided to stop? What if it had decided to tell? Night fell over Beacon's Edge like a curtain, thick and moonless. Thomas stood on the deck of the Carroway family yacht, a 40-foot vessel named the Providence, watching as Frank Morrison and 3 dock workers prepared the diving equipment. The boat rocked gently in the swells, its running lights extinguished to avoid drawing attention. They were anchored 2 miles offshore, directly above the first drop site according to Thomas's coordinates. The water below was black and impenetrable, hiding whatever lay in its depths. Thomas had never personally inspected the crates after dropping them. There had never been a reason. The system worked. The ocean kept its secrets. But tonight, with 3 crates inexplicably surfacing and federal investigators en route, he needed answers. Frank emerged from below deck carrying a canvas diving suit, the heavy rubberized fabric designed for deep water salvage work. "We're ready, sir. Depth here is about 70 feet. The diver can stay down 20 minutes, maybe 30 if the currents are calm." Thomas nodded. "I want photographs if possible. I need to know what's happening to those weights." The diver, a man named Paulson who'd worked salvage operations in Boston Harbor, began suiting up. He was 40, built like a dock worker, with the calm demeanor of someone who'd faced underwater dangers before. He checked his airline, tested his weighted boots, and gave Frank a thumbs up. "Remember," Thomas said, "you're looking for a wooden crate, 3 feet long, marked with a C. Check the weights, see if they're intact or damaged. If you can bring one up, do it." Paulson nodded and stepped to the rail. Frank and the other men helped him over the side, playing out the airline as he sank into the darkness. The line went taut, then slack, then taut again as Paulson descended. Thomas watched the bubbles breaking the surface, counting seconds, imagining the diver sinking through layers of cold water toward the ocean floor. 20 feet, 40 feet, 60 feet. The airline suddenly jerked violently. Frank grabbed it, struggling to keep tension. "Something's wrong. He's signaling to come up." "Give him more time," Thomas ordered. "Sir, 3 jerks means emergency. That's the signal." Thomas's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Frank and the crew began hauling the line, pulling hand over hand as the air hose came up faster than it should. When Paulson's helmet broke the surface, the man was thrashing, his movements panicked and desperate. They dragged him aboard, struggling with his weight and the cumbersome suit. Frank unscrewed the helmet. Paulson's face was sheet white, his eyes wide and unfocused. He gasped for air, his chest heaving like he'd been drowning despite the steady oxygen supply. "What happened?" Thomas demanded. "What did you see?" Paulson shook his head, still struggling to breathe. "Nothing, there's nothing down there." "What do you mean, nothing?" "The crates, they're gone. All of them." Paulson's voice shook. "I found the site, saw the marks in the sand where they should be. But they're not there anymore, just empty spaces and drag marks leading away." Thomas felt the deck shift beneath his feet, though the water was calm. "Drag marks? Leading where?" "Toward deeper water, out toward the trench." Paulson looked up at Thomas with something close to fear. "Sir, whatever moved those crates, it wasn't human. The marks were too wide, too deep. And there was something else." "What?" "Sound. I heard something moving in the darkness beyond the light. Something big." One of the crew members, a young man named Davies, laughed nervously. "Come on, Paulson, you're spooked by shadows." But Paulson wasn't laughing. "I know what I heard, and I know what I saw. Those crates didn't float up on their own. Something took them. Something brought them to the surface." Thomas turned away, gripping the rail. His mind refused to accept what Paulson was suggesting, that some force beneath the waves had deliberately retrieved the crates and sent them back. That was impossible. Superstitious nonsense. There had to be a rational explanation. "Take us to the next site," he ordered. "We check them all." They spent the next 3 hours moving between coordinates, dropping Paulson at each location. Every report was the same: empty spaces in the sand, drag marks leading deeper, the crates gone. By the time they reached the final site, Thomas's carefully maintained composure was cracking. 17 crates containing nearly $500,000 had vanished from the ocean floor, taken by something his diver couldn't or wouldn't describe. As they prepared to return to port, Frank approached Thomas at the stern. "Sir, what do we do now?" Thomas stared at the dark water. "We find out who's doing this. Someone knows about the drop sites. Someone salvaging our cargo and making it look mysterious to throw us off." "And if it's not someone?" Frank asked quietly. "If Paulson's right, if something down there—" "Don't!" Thomas cut him off. "I won't entertain ghost stories and fishermen's tales. There's a logical explanation, and we're going to find it before the federal investigators arrive." But as the Providence turned toward shore, its engines rumbling in the darkness, Thomas couldn't shake the image Paulson had described. Drag marks leading into deeper water, the sound of something massive moving in the depths. The Carroways had used the ocean for decades, treating it like a tool, a vault, a servant that would guard their secrets without question. What if the ocean had tired of serving? What if it had decided to collect what it was owed? The thought was absurd, irrational, impossible. Thomas pushed it away, but it lingered like cold water seeping through a hull, finding cracks, spreading slowly into spaces that should have stayed dry and safe. The Atlantic doesn't forget, and sometimes it demands payment. Morning brought no relief. Thomas returned to the mansion as dawn broke over the Atlantic, his clothes smelling of salt and diesel, his mind churning with questions that had no rational answers. He dismissed the crew with warnings to stay silent, paid them extra to ensure their discretion, but he knew word would spread. Beacon's Edge was a small town and fishermen talked. Margaret met him in the hallway, still in her dressing gown, her face tight with worry. "You were out all night. Thomas, what's happening?" "Business," he said curtly, moving past her toward his study. She followed. "Don't lie to me." Helena heard the servants saying more crates washed up. "The town's talking about federal investigators. If there's scandal coming—" "There's no scandal," Thomas interrupted, but his voice lacked conviction. He poured himself bourbon despite the early hour, his hand steady through sheer force of will. "Just complications. They'll be resolved." "How?" Margaret's composure was cracking, revealing the fear she usually kept buried. "How do you resolve federal investigators? How do you explain money hidden in the ocean?" Thomas turned sharply. "Who told you about the money?" "I'm not stupid, Thomas. I've known for years that our wealth comes from more than shipping. I've looked the other way because that's what wives do. But if this affects our children—" A knock interrupted her. Frank Morrison entered without waiting for permission, his face ashen. "Sir, you need to see this now." They followed Frank to the cliff behind the mansion, where the lawn gave way to rocky outcroppings and a steep drop to the beach below. A crowd had gathered, servants, groundskeepers, the stable boy. They stood in a semicircle staring down at the sand. Thomas pushed through them and stopped cold. Crates, dozens of them. They lined the beach in neat rows, arranged with deliberate precision, each one marked with the Carrowway Sea. The morning sun illuminated them like evidence at a crime scene. Thomas counted quickly. 17 crates. Every single one he'd dropped over the past 3 years, returned and displayed for anyone to see. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Even she could understand what this meant, the scale of it, the impossibility of hiding it now. Thomas felt the world tilting, his carefully constructed empire crumbling like sand beneath waves. "Who did this?" he demanded, turning to Frank. "Who brought them here?" "No one, sir. The night watchman swears the beach was empty at midnight. He checked again at 4, and they were there. All of them, like they washed up on the tide." "That's impossible. The tide doesn't arrange crates in rows." But even as Thomas said it, he knew how it looked. How it would look to the federal investigators, to the townspeople, to anyone who saw this display. It looked like a message, like someone or something had carefully, deliberately returned everything the Carroways had tried to hide. Eleanor appeared beside him, still in her nightgown. her dark hair loose around her shoulders. At 16, she was too observant for Thomas's comfort, too willing to ask questions. She looked at the crates, then at her father. "What were you hiding?" she asked quietly. Thomas couldn't answer. He was staring at the beach, at the impossible arrangement of evidence, trying to understand how his secrets had been torn from the ocean floor and laid bare for the world to see. The Atlantic had protected the Carroways for 3 generations. Now it was destroying them. The federal investigator arrived on the afternoon train, a thin man in his 50s named Howard Birch, who carried a leather briefcase and the patient determination of a bloodhound. Thomas met him at the station with a forced smile, playing the role of cooperative businessman despite the panic coiling in his chest. "Mr. Carroway, thank you for meeting me," Birch said, shaking hands with a grip that was surprisingly strong. "I understand there's been some unusual activity in your waters. A misunderstanding, I'm sure," Thomas replied smoothly, happy to clear things up. They drove to the mansion in uncomfortable silence. Birch spent the journey staring out the window at the harbor, at the fishing boats and commercial vessels, his sharp eyes missing nothing. When they arrived, Thomas led him to the study, offering coffee that Birch declined. "Let's not waste time," Miss Birch said, opening his briefcase. "Captain Reeves filed a detailed report about a crate containing approximately $50,000 in cash and bearer bonds. He claims it came from your property. I'd like to hear your explanation." Thomas had prepared his story. "Emergency funds kept on our vessels for port fees and unexpected expenses. Standard practice in the shipping industry. If crew members disposed of it improperly, that's theft, and I'll prosecute them accordingly." Birch nodded, making notes. "And the 17 additional crates that appeared on your beach this morning?" Thomas felt his stomach drop. "You've already heard about those?" "Mr. Carroway, the entire town has heard about them. They're rather hard to miss." Birch looked up, his expression neutral. "I'd like to inspect them, with your permission, of course." There was no refusing. Thomas led him down to the beach, where the crates still sat in their neat rows. Several had been opened by curious townspeople before Thomas's men could secure the area. Bonds, cash, and financial documents were visible inside, damning evidence of tax evasion, smuggling, and a dozen other federal crimes. Birch examined each crate methodically, photographing them, documenting their contents. His face revealed nothing, but Thomas knew what he was seeing. Years of hidden wealth, proof of systematic fraud. When Birch finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "Mr. Carroway, I'm going to need detailed records of every shipping transaction your company has conducted for the past 5 years. Bank statements, cargo manifests, crew rosters, everything." "Of course," Thomas said, though he knew those records would only deepen his guilt. "May I ask how long this investigation will take?" Birch looked at him with something resembling pity. "As long as necessary. In the meantime, I'd advise you not to leave town. And Mr. Carroway," he gestured at the crates, "I'd very much like to know how these ended up arranged so carefully on your beach, because in 30 years of federal investigation, I've never seen evidence present itself quite so conveniently." Thomas had no answer. That night, alone in his study with the bourbon bottle and his leather journal, he tried to make sense of what had happened. Someone had to be orchestrating this. A rival, a disgruntled employee, someone with intimate knowledge of his operation and the resources to salvage dozens of crates from deep water. But who? And why arrange them so deliberately, like a prosecutor laying out evidence for a jury? The alternative, that the ocean itself had decided to expose him, was madness. Yet Thomas couldn't shake the memory of Paulson's description, drag marks leading to deeper water, the sound of something massive moving in the darkness. The Carroways had treated the Atlantic like a tool for decades, dumping their secrets into its depths without thought or gratitude. What if the ocean had grown tired of being used? The investigation consumed Beacon's Edge like a slow-burning fire. Federal agents arrived in pairs, interviewing dock workers, fishermen, anyone who'd seen the crates or worked on Carroway vessels. The town divided into camps, those who'd always suspected the family's wealth was dirty, and those who'd benefited too much from Carroway generosity to turn against them now. Thomas watched his empire crumble in slow motion. Ships were impounded, bank accounts frozen, business partners suddenly unavailable. Margaret stopped hosting dinner parties. William returned from Harvard, his future suddenly uncertain, and Eleanor watched it all with eyes too knowing for 16, asking questions Thomas couldn't answer. "Did you really think the ocean would hide it forever?" she asked one evening, finding him in his study. Thomas looked up from the legal documents his attorney had delivered. "You shouldn't concern yourself with this." "Why not? It's my future too." Eleanor sat across from him, her posture straight, her voice steady. "The servants are saying things, that the ocean gave back what you put down there, that it's a judgment. Servants gossip. It means nothing." "Then explain it," Eleanor challenged. "Explain how 17 crates came up from the ocean floor and arranged themselves on our beach. Explain how something ripped steel weights off them in water 70 feet deep." Thomas had no explanation. The rational part of his mind insisted there had to be human agency involved. Sabotage, revenge, a coordinated effort to destroy him. But the evidence didn't support it. The dive sites were spread across miles of ocean. Moving that much cargo would require boats, equipment, dozens of people, and no one had seen anything. "There are things in this world we don't understand," Eleanor said quietly. "Grandfather used to tell me stories about the ocean, how it remembers everything that happens in its waters, every ship that sank, every body that drowned, every secret that got buried in the depths. He said the Atlantic keeps accounts. Your grandfather was a superstitious old man. He was the one who started hiding money in the ocean, and he told me once, near the end, that he regretted it. Said we'd taken too much without giving back, said the ocean would collect its due eventually." Eleanor stood. "Maybe this is the collection, Father." After she left, Thomas sat in the growing darkness, his daughter's words echoing in his mind. His grandfather had been many things: ruthless businessman, bootlegger, tax cheat, but not superstitious. Yet in his final months dying of cancer in the bedroom upstairs, he'd raved about debts owed and accounts coming due. Thomas had dismissed it as morphine-induced delirium. Now he wondered. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Frank Morrison entered, his face grave. "Sir, there's been a development. Captain Reeves is missing." Thomas felt ice settle in his stomach. "Missing how?" "Went out fishing yesterday morning. Never came back. Coast Guard found his boat drifting 5 miles offshore, engine running. No one aboard. His nets were out but empty. Coffee was still warm in his thermos. Accident? Maybe. But his crew says he was planning to testify to the federal investigators. Had a meeting scheduled for tomorrow." Frank paused. "People are talking, sir, saying the ocean took him. Payment for exposing what was hidden." Thomas wanted to dismiss it as coincidence, but fear was creeping in. Cold and insidious. Reeves had been the first to find the crates, the first to ask questions, the first to bring federal attention. And now he was gone, vanished into the same waters that had kept Carroway secrets for decades. "Find out everything you can," Thomas ordered. "Search parties, witness statements, anything unusual." But he already knew what they'd find. Nothing. Just like the crates that had appeared on his beach, Reeves's disappearance would have no rational explanation, no evidence, no answers. The ocean had given back what the Carroways had hidden, and now it was taking something in return. 3 days after Reeves vanished, Thomas Carroway made a decision. He couldn't fight federal investigators with lawyers. He couldn't explain the impossible with logic, and he couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. The ocean had returned what he'd hidden, had taken Reeves for exposing it, and wasn't finished yet. He needed to go to the source. That night, Thomas took a small motorboat out alone against Frank's protests and Margaret's tears. He navigated to the deepest drop site, the place where he'd sunk the first crate 3 years ago. The water was calm, the sky clear enough to see stars despite the new moon. Thomas cut the engine and sat in the silence, listening to the gentle lap of waves against the hull. "I don't know if you can hear me," he said aloud, his voice feeling foolish in the darkness. "I don't know if there's anything out there listening. But if there is, if the ocean keeps accounts like my grandfather said, then I'm here to settle mine." The water remained calm. No answer, no sign. Thomas almost laughed at his own desperation. He was talking to the ocean like a lunatic, hoping for absolution from salt water and darkness. Then the boat rocked. Not from waves. Something had moved beneath it, something large enough to displace water, and send ripples spreading in perfect circles. Thomas gripped the gunwale, his heart hammering. The water around the boat began to glow, not bright, but with a faint phosphorescence that outlined shapes in the depths, and Thomas saw them, the crates, all 17 of them, suspended in the water below his boat like they were floating in air. They hung there, impossible and undeniable, surrounded by the faint glow. Around them shapes moved, massive, indistinct, like shadows given weight and purpose. "What do you want?" Thomas whispered. The crates began to sink, slowly, deliberately. As they descended, the shapes moved with them, guiding them down into darkness. Thomas understood. The ocean was showing him what happened, how the crates had been retrieved, carried to the surface, arranged on his beach, not by human hands, but by something that lived in the depths, something that had watched the Carroways dump their secrets year after year and decided enough was enough. The glow faded. The shapes vanished. The water returned to black, calm. But Thomas understood the message. The ocean had given back what the Carroways had taken. The debt was paid, in exposure, in scandal, in Reeves's disappearance, in the destruction of everything Thomas had built. He started the engine and turned toward shore. Behind him, the Atlantic stretched endless and dark, keeping its remaining secrets. Thomas knew he'd lost everything, his fortune, his reputation, his freedom once the federal investigation concluded. But he'd gained something too, certainty. The ocean had been patient for decades, accepting what the Carroways buried in its depths, until it decided to collect. When Thomas reached the dock, federal agents were waiting. Howard Birch stood at the end of the pier, flanked by marshals. "Thomas Carroway, you're under arrest for tax evasion, smuggling, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government." Thomas didn't resist. He stepped onto the dock calmly, offering his wrists for the handcuffs. As they led him away, he looked back at the water one final time. The Atlantic stretched to the horizon, calm and eternal. It had protected the Carroways for 3 generations, and in one summer it had destroyed them. Not with violence or malice, but with simple truth, returning what they'd hidden, exposing what they'd buried, proving that some debts can't be hidden forever. The ocean remembers, and eventually it collects what it's owed. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.